Hi, welcome back to our channel. Today I'm going to talk about exposure. Do you have problem with your photos? Sometimes they are dark, sometimes it's too bright. This means that you didn't nail the exposure. To fix this problem, first we need to know that photography is the art of capturing light. If your photo are dark, this means that your photo is underexposed. And this means that if your photo is too bright, it means that your photo is overexposed. To get a great or correct exposure, we need to balance three things right. There are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. These three make up what we call the exposure pyramid. In auto mode, there is a high chance that your camera will not get it right because you do not get any control over these settings. For me, the best is to use manual mode. In manual mode, we get to control the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. But before that, we need to know what is a good exposure and where to look for the metering. Generally, for good exposure, we want the reading to be at the center of the metering. You can find the metering reader in your viewfinder or your screen. If the meter is negative, this means that your photo will be underexposed, and the other way around, positive means overexposed. To get in the center or to get the right exposure, we need to adjust the shutter, aperture, and ISO. The best way to start is with your shutter speed. For those who use Nikon, the shutter control dial is at the back. Okay, for shutter speed, I will always set or start from shutter 60 to 125 and will adjust according to the situation. Most of the time for portrait, for events and interior setup, shutter speed between 60 to 125 are enough to prevent camera shake and get sharp image. Unless if you are shooting fast action or long exposure photos, then you will need faster shutter speed or slower shutter speed for long exposure. Always remember and identify the subject you want to capture. Are they going to be fast? Is the place going to be dark? So that you can set the best shutter speed for it. Here are the rule of thumb I learned from my experience. For interior setup, with wide angle lens, handheld, use a shutter speed between 30 to 80. For portrait, group photo, pictures, use shutter speed between 60 to 125. For people walking or moving slightly fast, use shutter speed between 125 to 250. Why I say we should begin with shutter speed? Because as I mentioned in my video earlier, shutter is like a gate in your camera located back of your lens. It controls the amount of light entering your camera and it also affects how motion is captured. If you set it to fast shutter speed, it means that it open and close very fast, limit lights entering and will freeze the motion. Fast shutter speed is good for fast action and at bright daylight. And for indoors, you may need to use slower shutter speed, but not too slow because we do not want to get blurry photos. Next is your aperture. To change the aperture, you can use the front dial. Before you set your aperture, you also need to decide what subject you want in focus. If your aperture is too wide, not much will be in focus, but you are allowing more light to enter. Because aperture not only affects your composition, it also affects the exposure. As I mentioned earlier, if you set it to small aperture, it will block more light and your photo will be dark if you did not change or compensate your shutter speed or ISO. Bear in mind that to get a sharp image, example to capture a group of 2 to 4 people, you should not use wide aperture because you might only get one person in focus and the rest will be blurry. For this, you need to use somewhere between f4 to 5.6, not too wide, not too small, slightly in the middle of the aperture range. Okay, moving on to ISO. Let's say you already set the shutter and the aperture you want, but the photo is still dark. This means that you should increase the ISO. To change the ISO, you can hit the ISO button and at the same time use your wheel dial to increase or reduce it. Be careful with high ISO. Yes, high ISO help you to increase brightness to your image. But with high ISO, it also means more noise in your photos and less detail, which we don't want. If the metering is showing overexposed, you should lower your ISO. Low Low ISO is the best. I myself always start with low ISO and increase it if needed. Okay, let's look at my setting here. Let's say we set the shutter speed to 60, aperture to 5.6 and ISO to 400. Say I want to capture something moving very fast. My maximum aperture setting is 5.6 and my shutter speed can be at certain speed to capture the motion. For example, between 250 to 500 for a moving car. I will need to increase my ISO to compensate for the exposure if my metering show negative. Right now it's at negative. Increasing. We have to increase the ISO to compensate the shutter. We have to increase the ISO to compensate the metering that show negative. Same goes with aperture. Let's say we go back to shutter 125 and ISO 400. Let's say I'm taking a landscape photo. I can reduce the shutter speed or increase the ISO. For landscape, the subject is not going to move and we hold the camera still, then we can reduce the shutter speed instead of increasing the ISO. Because if possible, we don't want to use high ISO. Remember, high ISO is less detail and more noise. I'm reducing the shutter speed to compensate the exposure metering. Now it's in the middle. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.